Welcome back to my channel. My name is Caitlin and I love all things beauty. Today I want to talk about spring eyeshadow palettes. Spring has sprung for the most part. There have been a couple days of cooler weather, but we are headed towards the general direction of spring. And as you can see, I've got a very springtime look on. Chose a very springtime eye look, which I used one of the palettes that I will be talking about today. Got a super bright lip on, and I've chosen this super bright green sweater. Everything else that I have on my face will be listed in the description below. If you like this kind of thing, subscribe before you go, and let's go ahead and get into the palettes. So I went through my eyeshadow palette collection and basically picked all of the palettes that to me embody spring. So spring isn't necessarily about pastels, which yes, pastels are often included, but also just like brighter colors in general, which I'm someone who will wear any color eyeshadow any time of year. I don't necessarily close myself off to categories like that. I went through my eyeshadow palette collection and basically picked the ones where the color stories as a whole scream springtime to me. I certainly have other eyeshadow palettes where like you can create a very springtime look with them, but the whole color story may not necessarily seem spring-like. So these are the palettes where like the whole thing is sort of spring to me. And I've got quite a few. So let's go ahead and just start talking about them. I'm going to start with the brands where I've only picked one palette from that brand to talk about, because I do have a few brands here where like there are quite a few palettes I think that are springtime to me. These are in no particular like favorite order or anything. I'm just talking through them. So the first one is the Shroud Cosmetics Creepy Cute. And I think this one is pretty obvious. It's a pastel palette, but it does have the black and the gray in there to really deepen things up if you want to. Now one thing, Shroud Cosmetics I think has maybe been having issues where like orders were placed, but maybe the owner like wasn't actually fulfilling orders for a certain amount of time. I don't know what's going on with that. I haven't placed an order with them for quite some time. But I will just mention that I think something might be going on with the brand. But this palette, I really like the pastels in it. So springtime palette number one. Next up, Natasha Denona pastel palette. Very springtime. It's got some pastels, but it does have some deeper colors, and these shimmers are quite nice. I really love the shade right here, which is called Duet. It's like a super ethereal pinky blue purple shade, and it's lovely. I will say I don't reach for this palette a lot. The shades require quite a bit of buildup in order to get anything remotely resembling how it looks in the pan, which is kind of a bummer. I feel like, so I've been on an indie brand eyeshadow kick lately, and I'm finding that a lot of indie brand mattes are just more pigmented in some ways, or just easier to build them up. And Natasha Denona for a while had been one of my favorite eyeshadow formulas. I found that the mattes were really pigmented and blendable, and like it didn't take a whole lot of work to build them up, but the pastels in here are definitely a little bit harder to work with, and the formulas that are the like cream to powder type formula, I find that those take a lot of work to get them to get the color payoff that you want. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this, which I don't think it's available anymore anyways. I think it was limited edition, but just throwing that out there. Funnily enough, I'm pretty sure the Natasha Denona palette is the only like mainstream brand that I pull the palette from. I think everything else that I have to talk about are all indie brands. That's a lie. I have one other palette that's not an indie brand, which I guess I'll talk about that now, and it's the Colourpop Twilight palette, which looks like this. Now, this is definitely leaning a little bit more on the earthy tone side of spring, but spring is also all about like growth and like plants growing and stuff. So I think the greens definitely help portray that. But I think the blues also just sort of make it pretty spring-like. I think you can use some of these shimmers to get spring-like vibes. I think it just definitely leans on the cooler toned side of things. Yeah, I think the mutedness of this and the tones of it are spring-like to me. Alright, so now everything else that I have to talk about are all indie brand palettes. So, Fantasy Cosmetica. This brand has really impressed me. I have all of their eyeshadow palettes now, and the Wizard palette is the latest in their launches. And I love the blue tones of this. You definitely have like the deeper tones to really darken it up, but I think just blue and yellow together definitely is spring. I also really like the shade Graviturgy. It's like a hollow chrome. It's this one right here. But I think these are definitely very spring-like. You can certainly put together a look that doesn't scream spring, like if you're only using the deeper tones of it, but overall, spring. Next up is the Bellabeautebar Basic Witch palette, or Basic Witch is like Halloween themed, but I definitely think the color story is springtime. You've got the lighter pinks and purples, but also the bright pink and like that mustard yellow I think definitely leans spring. And like this golden orange, the green, and definitely that pink right there. Gorgeous shimmers. I've also been super impressed with the Bellabeautebar formula. I've only tried a couple of their palettes, but this one was like the first one of theirs that I tried, and I really love how all of the looks that I've created turned out, and I'm definitely excited to try more from the brand. Dieverune Cosmetics, the Space Chemistry palette. This might not also be what you think of when spring, but I think the shimmer, like apart from the mattes, the shimmers in here are what really make it spring-like. Very ethereal, kind of muted but still bright. Is that possible? Muted but bright. I just think like the lighter tones of the shimmers in here, and again while still having a couple deeper shades. I kind of just think shimmers in general, if there's any sort of color to them, it can definitely lean spring. Shimmers are just like springtime, you know? Even though I wear shimmers all year round, but anyways. Okay, so those were the brands that I'd only pulled one palette from the brand to talk about. So every other brand that I'm going to talk about, I have 2 or more palettes that I pulled. I was just about to say that I've been super impressed with this next brand as well, but I feel like I can say that for every brand that I'm going to be talking about. I think I've officially switched to indie eyeshadow palette in terms of my consumption of makeup. Like when I see a mainstream release, I'm just, for the most part, not really excited about it. So this next brand is Gourmande Girls, and I have 2 palettes to talk about. The first one being the Nightshade palette with the purples, greens, and yellows. Springtime. Like, I love the combination of purple and green, and I love the combination of purple and yellow, and the shimmers in here are gorgeous. Of course, you've got the deeper tones, so like if you did a look with all the deeper shades, it might not necessarily like be spring, but I think overall, as a cohesive color story, I think it is very spring-like. Like, all of those shades, gorgeous. All right, the next palette from Gourmande Girls that I pulled to talk about is the Nueva Vida palette, which is like their most recent release. This is definitely leaning on like the super bright color side of things. So you've got some of the like neon shades, which those were actually a little bit harder to build up when I used them. I was only using like a basic eyeshadow primer. I think if I would have used like a tackier base or a more white base, I probably could have gotten them to build up a little bit quicker and easier. But these shades are gorgeous. Again, with the shimmers, they're just so pretty. All right, next brand up is Oden's Eye. There are maybe a couple more palettes that I probably could have pulled to talk about for Oden's Eye, but they were maybe just a little bit more summer-like, not quite full spring as these three that I picked. So the first palette is the Little Ghost palette, which was the collaboration with Angie, and that's what the inside looks like. Very spring. You've got some lighter muted tones, but then again also the darker shades to deepen something up. But look at those shimmers. So pretty. Alright, and then the next two palettes were part of the newest collaboration, the legendary Diversa. So I've got the Earthwood palette, which was the collab with Fancy Face, and the Spring Dragon palette, which was the collaboration with Judy. So the Spring Dragon palette is like full pastel. So pretty. And then the Earthwood palette, it is like half muted bright, half deeper, but the deeper shades are very earth toned, but like in like a green earth tone, not like brown earth tone. I mean, there is a brown or whatever, but I definitely think these shades right here really help solidify it in the springtime vibe. So those three were from the Earthwood, and I'll swatch a couple from the Spring Dragon. Alright, moving on to Nomad Cosmetics, I pulled two. The first being the Tokyo palette, which is now, I believe, discontinued. I think it's all sold out. This is definitely the pastel side of things. Something about this palette, the formula seems a little bit different than some of the newer palettes that I've tried. They just all seem very light and like satiny kind of. Like, I feel like there's only a couple that are like true mattes, and then like the whole bottom row I think are like all topper type formulas, but it's very pretty nonetheless. It just definitely is going to give a more muted look. And then the other palette that I pulled is the Ireland Wild Atlantic Way, which I was actually lucky enough to win in an Instagram giveaway. The greens are really what make it spring for me. Like, all of the shades of green is just like all of the shades of spring. And then like you do have the more blue shade that's in here, but apart from that, it's really the greens that do it. Very pretty. Alright, next up is the Dieverune Cosmetics, and I only have 2 eyeshadow palettes from them, and I pulled both of them because they are very spring-like. The first is the Moth and the Moon palette. I picked this up when they did the restock where they only had 50 palettes or something. Gorgeous. Like the shimmer shade that's above the teal, so pretty. It's the one on this finger right here. When I first used it, like I wasn't fully expecting that shift because in the pan it kind of just looks like a white shimmer. Like I could tell that there was like a little bit of a shift to it, but once you get it on your finger and put it on the eye, it's like so much more than I thought it was going to be, and it's gorgeous. And then the second palette from them is the Gloomy Gardens palette. Again, super pretty. I feel like this is a brand that kind of came out of nowhere for me. I had seen them on Instagram, and then Millie from Bad to the Brow, I think is like friends with the owner or something. She did, I think, the palette artwork for this. I can't fully remember, but I watched her video on it and I kind of like knew that I had to have it. And I'm very glad that I picked both of these palettes up. They've been great additions to my collection. The next brand is Kaleidos, and I kind of feel like they've kind of taken a turn in their like style that I don't really care about. Like the last couple of releases that they've had have just been like the quads, and they're all kind of like boring to me. I feel like they kind of should have stayed in the realm of what they were doing before. So 2 of the palettes that I chose are from the Futurism collection, and I feel like that was really where they were hitting their stride. So the first one that I'll talk about is the Futurism 6, which is the Lunar Lavender palette. The purple's in there, very springtime, and then the 2 shimmers. So pretty, very spring. And then on the brighter side of things, the Futurism 4 palette, which is the neon or VR neon. So I think the red in there doesn't necessarily make it spring, but I think the neons of everything else do, and then both shimmers I think are pretty spring-like, which the neon swatches on my fingers don't really make them look that great, but when they're on the eye and like when you use a primer and stuff with them, I think that they always look good. Next from Kaleidos is the Flower Punk palette, which looks like this. You get the brightness over here, and then definitely the more plant vibes over there. Love this. And I actually have a video from a while back where I duped it with eyeshadows in my collection. So since this isn't available anymore, I will link that palette below. And I think all of the shades I used you could still get. It was very much a mishmash between a bunch of different stuff in my collection, but I think you can definitely still dupe the vibes of this since you can't get this any longer, but this was still just a great palette from them. And then the last from Kaleidos is the Escape Pod. Just so spring. You've got the bright colors on the top, the more like neutrally colors on the bottom, and then the middle row is basically all toppers for the most part. I suppose the last 2 aren't so toppery, but like very spring. I wish Kaleidos would go back to doing more stuff like this, although the packaging is a little bit bulky for what it needs to be, but I don't know, I think it looks nice on a shelf. I also have the the Club Nebula palette. Kind of spring, but not really. But I think these just look really nice on a shelf together, so I wish Kaleidos would kind of move away from what they've been doing and sort of go back to some of their older style. Okay, I have 3 more brands to talk about, starting with Blend Bunny Cosmetics. I think Blend Bunny in general could definitely be seen as like almost all of their palettes being pretty spring-like, because they're known for having colorful palettes. Like, they only have a couple more neutrally type palettes, but I've picked 4 to talk about. So the first is the Sugar and Grunge. Then the second is the Sickly Sweet, which this one is the more pastel leaning. But again, you have the deeper colors to like deepen up outer corners, which is generally how I do my eyeshadow most of the time, is I use a darker color to deepen up the outer corner. Gorgeous, both of these palettes. And then the Machina palette. Definitely spring to me. You've got the brighter pinks and purple, and then the green row totally is like plant-like spring to me. And then I think the blues on their own, like I'm wearing blue today, and that's definitely really spring to me. I think this palette, a lot of people were kind of like, I don't get it in terms of the color story, which I don't know that I've really like mixed up any of the rows, but I think like each row on their own totally makes a cool eye look, and definitely springtime to me. And then the last palette that I pulled for Blend Bunny is the Lure palette, which I'm pretty sure the look that I made today, like I could have probably made it with this palette, but I didn't. Definitely spring. I'm coming to realize that Blend Bunny isn't necessarily my favorite eyeshadow formula. I tend to have to work a little bit more to make the looks turn out how I want, and sometimes I have to like vary the eyeshadow primer that I've used in order to get the like effect that I want. But you can basically go to them for like any color that you're looking for. It's probably in a Blend Bunny palette. Alright, next brand is Adept Cosmetics. I feel like I kind of have a lot to talk about for Adept. First, they do like shimmer really well. I feel like a lot of their shimmers that they do can be considered spring. Some of the mattes aren't necessarily spring, so I've only pulled the palettes with the mattes in it that I think help the shimmers pull off the springtime. So I have some of their palettes that are depotted into my singles collection. Like, I've kept them in the form of like how they were in the palette. So the first palette that I think is spring is the Plain Jane, and I have the original one, which is like this bottom 2 rows. But definitely they have the ethereal type shades, and then even these shades, they are a little bit deeper, but I think they're still springy. The second palette from Adept is the Kal-El palette, so like the Superman inspired, which is the one that's over here, sort of disjointed. I guess I could have gone to find the palettes and like put it back in, but can't be bothered. This is definitely leaning on the like orangey fiery side of spring. Alright, the Seahorse palette, which was all shimmer, and they're all super light color base and definitely are just like ethereal shades. This one you definitely could just do like one shimmer on the lid and call it a look. I usually pull some mattes from other palettes when I'm using this, but I still really like a lot of these shades. Element 115. I think this one might be like the darkest springtime one that I pulled, but I still think the colors that are in here are still spring. They just are leaning a little bit on the darker side, but so pretty. Okay, and then the last palette from the Adept brand is the Cyborg Choir. I've been loving this palette. And it does have a few hollow shades in it, which I feel like that's the latest trend that a lot of indie brands are going to, is like coming out with hollow shades. Gorgeous palette. All right, last brand is Unearthly Cosmetics. First up is the Spaced Out palette. Very pretty. I picked this up when they were doing the 50% off warehouse sale. It was kind of a bummer that you could only get the palette in the box, this one and the other larger box. I did not get that one, but this is from the smaller mystery box. Then the Charmer palette. I guess this is also leaning on sort of the darker end of things, but I think the shimmers in here and then definitely these lighter mattes in here really pull it off as a spring palette. And then lastly, the palette that I used on my eyes today is the Don't Be Jelly. So pretty. So I used this one on the front half and the lower lash line, this one on the outer corner of the lid, this one on the full, basically the full lid apart from like a little bit on the outer corner, and then I used this one on the inner corner and the brow bone. It's so pretty. Okay, I feel like I'm covered in glitter from all of the swatching. Right, those are all of my springtime eyeshadow palettes that I have in my collection. I hope it gave you maybe some sort of inspiration to go look at your collection and think about some springtime shades. Again, you probably have springtime shades in any eyeshadow palette that you have if you're one who likes colorful eyeshadow palettes. A lot of palettes definitely you can get springtime looks even if they aren't necessarily springtime color stories. I'm glad that I took the time to sort of rake through my collection to find these, because I know that I'll definitely be reaching for a few of these in the next coming weeks, and I'm excited to use them. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button, and if you like stuff like this, subscribe before you go. I've been doing a lot of shop my stashes. I've been doing some declutters here and there, and just sort of trying to use some makeup that I already have while also sprinkling some new things here and there. I've definitely been going through a phase of getting a lot of indie eyeshadow palettes. I kind of need to cool it off for a little bit, but I have been excited getting more into that realm of things. So I would love to have you stick around. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!